G'day, I'm Patrick from Douglas Fir Design. Welcome to the Router Bits. So I already have a jointer in the shop and I have a thicknesser as well. They both have a 300 wide bed on them. And occasionally I get a big chunk of timber, like this big chunk of red gum that's wider than I can put through my thicknesser or my jointer. And that's where using your router as a surface planer comes in really handy. Building a surface planing jig for your router is pretty simple, and I was able to just use bits and pieces that I had lying around here. And I think that's important, like it shouldn't cost you too much to build. If you're doing it all the time, you could go and set up a dedicated thing using some really nice aluminium rails, but I'll just show you what I used. For the rails themselves, I've used some 25mm MDF because that's what I had lying around, and also some angle iron just to stop them falling over, and you'll see how I clamp them down in a second. The reason I've used MDF is as the temperature changes and the humidity changes, they're not going to warp or bend like other raw timber will. You could definitely use structural pine if you wanted to dress it up, but you'd want to build the jig pretty soon after you dressed the face, because a few days after that it might bend again. So these MDF rails are both exactly the same height. From memory, I think they're 90mm high, and they're dead flat. I cut them on the table saw and made sure that they were dead flat. If they're not, they're going to affect the flatness of the piece that you're actually trying to plane. So these need to be your reference. And in turn, the surface that you're actually building this jig on, or setting it on, also needs to be flat. So this is just on my assembly table. It's relatively flat, but I might like to put some little shims underneath each edge and check it all if I'm doing a piece that I want to be really careful about. Alright, so after building your rails, I've made these really long because occasionally I want to do a large slab with them. You'll need to build yourself a sled for your router to actually sit into. Basically, all it is, in this case it's a box, and I put these rails on it to make sure that there's no vertical flex, even if I spread these out to about 1.2 wide and I want to do a really nice large slab. And then my router, which I've created a little matching plate and insert, just slides down in there and it will slide back and forth like that. So you don't have to create a base plate that's square. You can just use the standard black base plate on your router, but in time I think I'd like to get a larger motor body to use in this jig, and so I wanted to make sure that my sled was large, and my box was large enough to accommodate a larger router. And by building a little wooden base plate, it means that I can kind of fit any router onto this base plate quite easily without rebuilding the entire jig. If you know which router you're going to use, all you need to do is measure the width of that base plate and build your box accordingly so that it fits. You just don't want to make it too tight or it just won't move smoothly like this one does. You can see that it just slides along there really nice and easily. The other thing that you'll notice about this box sled that I've created is it's got a hole in the center. That's where the router bit actually goes through, and you've got to make sure that that hole is wide enough to fit that router bit. What I did is I placed the router in there, plunged a little bit down so I knew exactly the location where the bit was going to go through, and then I cut the rest of that using a table saw. You could use a jigsaw or a circular saw or whatever you'd like, and I've just drilled out the ends, and I will make them neat at some later stage, but right now I've just left them pretty raw. The router doesn't go anywhere near them anyway. The beauty of one of these jigs is that you can use very uneven pieces of timber, and it obviously allows you to do larger bits that you could normally do in a thicknesser or a jointer. And I'll show you some of the basic setup processes that you need to do with a big slab that I'm going to try and plane out now. My rails are 90mm high. This chunk that I want to plane down is only 60mm, and so I really need to bring this up closer to the bit, or I'm just not going to have enough length in the shank of that actual planer bit to get down to the timber. So in this case, the easiest thing for me to do is to grab some of this 25mm MDF, which I have a bit of sitting around. Chaos. lay it down in here, and that will just raise this up a little bit. Here's my other piece. Then I can place this down on those, and it brings it within about 1.5 centimeters of the top. The next thing that's worth doing is putting some spaces between your rails and the actual workpiece. The reason I like doing this is I don't want my router bit to constantly bite into the workpiece, and you might notice that it has already happened because the first time I did this I wasn't using those spaces. I want these rails to last me a while, so I don't want to eat them away with my router bit. So I've got some 60mm stock here. It shouldn't come in contact with the router bit because it's going to be sitting below the surface of our workpiece. Just drop them in there. Same thing on the other side. Okay, so now we have rails, some chocking material, this 25mm MDF underneath on both sides. The next thing we need to do is to make sure that this piece doesn't rock. Now it does have a bit of a twist in it, so we might just need to grab some little wedges which I had lying around. You can easily make these on whatever really, out of whatever you have, as long as you make some little wedgy material. And we're going to put them underneath the edges that are high and make sure we can get it really solid. And it's also important when we're doing this that we're getting most of our height relatively even across this, because we don't want to have to be taking off 1 centimeter on one point and then having a really low patch somewhere else. So I'll show you a good way of doing that. So in order to make sure that this piece of wood is basically even in line with the rails, what I've done is laid a piece across the rails that I can slide back and forth, and I'll use my little tiny ruler here to basically check how far the timber is below my reference rail here. So that's about 12mm there, about 10mm there, that's about 15 there, and about 10 there. So because it's so far further below on this corner, we might actually raise this up a little bit to get it more even. It'll just mean less cutting on these high sides. I've got this about as even as it's going to get. There's naturally a bit of twist in this board, and that's why we're doing this, to make it flat. So I've wedged all 4 sides, and now I'm just going to clamp the rails down and pull them in together to hold all of this in place, and then we can basically start going. So I've clamped 3 points of the rails down. This one is solid, and one end of this front one is solid. And what I'm going to do now is just apply a little bit of a pressure on the end here, and that's just going to sandwich the piece in between those rails and stop it from moving. If you're doing a small piece, people often like to double-sided tape them down onto whatever platform they're working on. This clamping pressure really keeps this locked in place as well, and it's what I've found works for these large pieces. Now that our rails are in place and they're dead flat, which is something that you need to check, we're going to put our sled onto the rails, place our router motor into that sled, and now we need to set the height, the depth of our bit. So depending on how much material you have to take off, if it's very little, if the thing is already pretty flat, the best thing to do is to lower the router bit so it touches the lowest piece of the work. You'll still have to do a couple passes, but that ensures that you're going to get it down to that lowest point. Because this is quite uneven and I need to take off about 5mm, it's also really tough, it's a big old hunk of red gum. I'm going to set it just 1mm or 2 below the highest bits, and I'll have to do it in multiple passes. The first pass, we'll just take off these top corners, and then as I lower it down, it'll come down into that lower section as well. You'll notice that I've got the big roller door open, which we don't normally do in here, but this bit is so effective, it produces a hell of a lot of dust. Even with my vacuum connected directly to the router, I still don't want to be breathing all of that in. So once I start using this, I'll turn all the fans on and push all that dust out through the door.
Gotta check that text now,
Alright, so I've set the depth to just take off these high points first. And basically what I'll be doing is moving this forward and back, moving it along, forward and back, and doing that the whole way across the board. All right. I've done that first pass. I've dropped the height of the bit down by about 2 mil. Now I'm going to do the second pass. We managed to get this pretty close to perfect in 2 passes. On that last pass I was taking off probably close to 4 mil in some sections, but it handled it perfectly. You'll notice a few sort of reference lines on the face, and that's just where probably a little piece of sawdust got underneath my plate and made the router bit slightly uneven, but they look way worse than they feel. It actually feels dead smooth, and so with a couple of passes with a sander or a scraper, you'll get rid of them straight away. Once you've got a jig like this, you could essentially use any router bit to do what I've done here, within reason. But the reason that these work so well is you've got a 50 mil diameter, so you can do quite wide passes. If you're using a smaller flush trim or whatever else straight bit, you'd have to do twice as many passes. It's also got 6 little carbide blades on it, which means they stay sharp, it's really efficient, the bit doesn't have to work too hard, and so it just does exactly what it's designed for. Because this is quite a large bit at 50 mil or so, you need to run it at slightly slower than top speed. So you probably just bring your router down from its higher speed, and that'll be suitable. Alright, so I'm just going to check that this piece that I've flattened is actually flat. Looks pretty good, looks like it's about half a mil out, and that's because my 2 rails would have been slightly off axis. If I was doing a really long piece that was important, I just need to make sure that the rails were a little closer to being flat. There's plenty of really good videos online that go into detail about that because it's a bit of a dark art, but it is worth learning how to do. But for my purposes, for what this is going to be, that's perfect. Now that we've got one side perfectly flat, we can flip it over using this as a reference and do the other side in a couple passes. It's dead easy. And then you can choose whichever side you want to use as your face, give it a little sand, and you're done. Really nice way. In fact, it's the only way to do a big slab like this unless you want to invest $10,000 in a huge thicknesser or jointer. So yeah, you can grab these surface planing bits from Timbecon, grab them on their website or in any of their stores.